Welcome, welcome. Let's dive right in.
The casting call had been out for months. The role was legendary even before the cameras started rolling. Sebastian Vale, a haunted detective with a razor-sharp mind and a past so dark it threatened to consume him, was the lead in Vale, an ambitious neo-noir TV series. The producers knew they needed someone special. Not just an actor, but the actor, someone who could embody the role so completely that audiences would forget they were watching a performance. They saw hundreds of men. Some were big names, A-listers with Oscars and blockbusters under their belts. Others were up-and-comers, hungry for their break. They all brought their versions of Sebastian Vale to life. And they all failed. Miles Greaves, the show's director, sat at the long casting table, his fingers drumming impatiently. "This is pointless," he muttered to his assistant. "Nobody gets it. Nobody is Sebastian." That was when Victor Halloway walked in. Nobody in the room knew him. He had no major credits, just a few theater performances and indie films so obscure they might as well have been whispers in the wind. His agent had practically begged to get him an audition slot. He wasn't imposing, just present. His dark eyes scanned the room, not nervously, but knowingly, like he had already sized up every person there. His face was sharp, angular, haunted. "Slate your name," the casting director instructed, barely looking up from her notes. Victor tilted his head slightly, as if the request amused him. Detective Vale is a man who drinks his coffee black, but only because cream reminds him of the night his mother died. Silence. Miles Greaves lifted his eyes from the script in front of him. "That's not in the material," one of the producers said. Victor smiled faintly. "It should be." Nobody told him to start reading. He just became Sebastian Vale. His shoulders hunched slightly, the weight of 1,000 regrets pressing down on them. His voice was rough but intelligent, edged with the exhaustion of a man who had seen too much. His fingers twitched slightly, as if itching for a cigarette he hadn't smoked in years. The scene was simple, Sebastian Vale interrogating a suspect. But Victor transformed it into something electric. He paced slowly, watching the invisible criminal with eyes that burned. His voice was soft but unyielding, a quiet force of nature. "Tell me what I already know," he said, leaning forward, his lips curling into a bitter smirk. "Because you and I both understand one thing. Men like you always talk in the end." For 5 minutes, the room wasn't a casting studio. It was a cold, rain-slicked interrogation room, and Victor wasn't acting. He was Sebastian Vale. Then he stopped. Silence. The producers looked at each other. Some shifted uncomfortably, as if they had just witnessed something private, something they shouldn't have seen. Miles Greaves finally exhaled. "Cancel the rest of the auditions," he said. Victor smiled again. A small, knowing thing. He had already known he had the role. From the first day on set, it was clear that Victor Halloway was different. Actors disappear into their roles all the time, but Victor? He stopped acting altogether. He didn't just play Sebastian Vale, he became him. It started subtly. He insisted on wearing Sebastian's clothes off camera. He refused to let the costume department clean them, preferring the natural wear and tear. Sebastian wouldn't care about appearances, he explained. Then he moved into an apartment that looked exactly like Sebastian's on the show, down to the peeling wallpaper and the cluttered desk full of unsolved cases. Nobody knew how he'd found a place that matched so perfectly. He never broke character. At first, the cast thought it was just extreme method acting. Some admired it. Others found it unsettling. Then, the improvisations began. Victor started adding lines that weren't in the script. But the strange part? They were better. One day, they were filming a pivotal scene, Sebastian interrogating a murderer. The original script had Sebastian hammering the suspect with questions. But when the cameras rolled, Victor just sat there, watching the actor across from him with unblinking intensity. Minutes passed. The other actor fidgeted. The silence was unbearable. Then Victor spoke, his voice low, sharp as a knife. "You lied to me twice already. You'll lie again. But not about this." The body was moved, wasn't it? The script supervisor frantically flipped through pages. That line wasn't there. The actor playing the suspect, Daniel Frost, hesitated. He had prepared for the scripted interrogation, not this. But something about the way Victor was looking at him, the certainty in his voice. Without thinking, Daniel nodded. "Yeah," he stammered. It was moved. The director, Miles Greaves, was stunned. "Cut," he yelled. He turned to Victor. "That was incredible. How did you know that line would work so well? Victor simply shrugged. Sebastian knew. Nobody knew what to say. Then the real problem started. The first omen. One night, Daniel Frost was watching the news in his trailer. A breaking story caught his eye. A real murder just a few miles away. A woman found dead in her apartment. No forced entry. A single bullet wound to the temple. It sounded eerily familiar. Daniel's stomach twisted. He pulled up his copy of the Vale script and flipped through the pages. Then his hands started to shake. The crime was nearly identical to one in an upcoming episode. The next day, Daniel approached Victor on set. Hey, man, you hear about that murder last night? Victor looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether to answer. Then he simply said, It wasn't a robbery. Daniel frowned. What? Victor exhaled, rubbing his temples. He looked tired. They'll find out soon enough. The wallet wasn't taken. It was personal. Daniel didn't know what to say. How do you know that? Victor gave him a small, tired smile. Because I wrote the scene. Daniel laughed nervously, but something in Victor's expression made the laughter die in his throat. You're kidding, right? Daniel asked. Victor said nothing. 2 days later, the police confirmed what Victor had said. The crime wasn't a robbery. It was personal, and the details matched the Vale script too well. The line between fiction and reality begins to blur. At first, the cast and crew brushed it off as coincidence. But then it started happening again and again. Victor would mention things that hadn't happened yet, things that shouldn't have been possible to predict. A missing person case, an unsolved hit and run, a serial burglar's next target. Every time, he was right. It wasn't just method acting anymore. It was something else. And then, one night, Victor disappeared. Victor Halloway had never been the kind of actor who made headlines. He had no messy scandals, no late-night bar fights, no disastrous interviews. But when he vanished, the media went insane. The producers of Vale were the first to report it. Victor had left the set without a word. He didn't show up the next morning. His phone was disconnected. At first, everyone assumed he had snapped. Maybe the role had consumed him. Maybe he needed a break. Then someone checked his apartment. It was empty. Not just lived-in empty, but eerily so, like he had never been there in the first place. The bed was neatly made. The fridge was stocked, though nothing had been touched. But on his desk, there was a single sheet of paper. Scrawled in Victor's unmistakable handwriting were just 5 words. There's another case. I'm needed. That was when people stopped calling it a breakdown. They started calling it something else. The clues he left behind. At first, the police weren't concerned. Actors go off-grid all the time. But as more details emerged, even the authorities began to feel uneasy. The first disturbing thing? Security footage. A camera outside Victor's apartment complex showed him leaving at 2:13 a.m. He was wearing a dark trench coat, Sebastian Vale's signature coat from the show. He walked down the street, moving with purpose, like a man who knew exactly where he was going. Then, at the corner of 5th and Halloway, something strange happened. He turned a corner, and never came out the other side. The footage was clean. No glitches. No blind spots. Victor simply walked into the darkness and vanished. That was when people started whispering. Had Victor Halloway truly become Sebastian Vale? Had he somehow crossed the boundary between fiction and reality? Or worse, had he always been something more? The predictions that came true. Then came the murders. It started 2 weeks after Victor's disappearance. A body was found downtown, killed in the exact same way as a case from Vale. At first, no one made the connection. But then, a journalist dug deeper. The case was a perfect recreation of an episode Victor had personally rewritten. Even the position of the body matched. Then it happened again, and again. Each time, the details aligned with cases from Vale, but only the ones Victor had improvised on set. The ones he had added himself. The police, once skeptical, started watching the show. Desperate for leads, they began treating Vale as more than fiction. They pored over Victor's performances, studying his improvisations, his unscripted moments. And they found something terrifying. In nearly every scene, Victor had left clues, phrases, gestures, throwaway lines that, when pieced together, formed a pattern. He hadn't just been acting. He had been leaving a trail. But to what? And more importantly, for who? The last broadcast. Then, one night, a video surfaced. It was an old, unaired scene from Vale. One that had never made it into the final cut. Nobody knew how it ended up online. In the scene, Sebastian Vale was standing in a dimly lit alley, his face half hidden by shadows. His coat billowed in the wind. His voice was steady, unshaken. "If you're watching this," he said, staring directly into the camera, "then you know. You've seen the signs." A pause, a slight smirk. "They always said I wasn't real. Just a character, a script brought to life. But I told you, didn't I?" He stepped forward, the darkness swallowing him bit by bit. "I told you, sooner or later, the truth would catch up." Then the screen cut to black. The clip had no metadata, no timestamps, no record of ever being filmed. And yet, the lighting, the wardrobe, the set, it was perfect. Almost as if Victor had filmed it himself. But there was just one problem. It wasn't from Vale. The scene had never been written. No one remembered shooting it. And worst of all, Victor Halloway was never in that alley. So where the hell did the footage come from? And where the hell was he now? After the mysterious footage surfaced, the world became obsessed with Victor Halloway's disappearance. Conspiracies spread like wildfire. Some believed Victor had staged everything, turning his own life into the ultimate performance. Others whispered that he had somehow rewritten reality, that his immersion into the role had gone so deep he had become Sebastian Vale in every sense. The strangest theory? That Vale had never been a TV show at all. It had been a message, a warning. But from who? And for what? Then, just when it seemed like the mystery would fade into legend, he came back. The return of Sebastian Vale. 3 years after his disappearance, Vale was long over. The show had been canceled. No actor dared to take over the role. The world had moved on. Then, one night, a live broadcast aired on an obscure local news channel. A grainy black and white feed. A familiar setting. A dimly lit alley. Rain slicking the pavement. And then, he stepped into frame. Victor Halloway. But not Victor. Sebastian Vale. The trench coat. The sharp eyes. The tired, knowing smirk. He hadn't aged a day. He looked straight into the camera, his voice calm. Measured. "You let it go," he said. "You forgot. But the case isn't closed." A pause. A slight tilt of his head. "You think you're safe. But you're not." The camera flickered. Static. Then, blackness. The signal cut out. The station later claimed they had no record of the broadcast. No saved footage. No interruptions in their programming. But thousands of people had seen it. And the very next day, a body was found. A perfect recreation of another Vale case. One that had never aired. The final mystery. The investigation reopened, but there was nothing to find. No prints. No evidence. No clues. Except for one. A single cigarette, half-smoked, found at the crime scene. A brand that hadn't been made in decades. The same brand Sebastian Vale smoked on the show. The case remains unsolved. Victor Halloway was never found. Some say he became the role so completely that he left our world and entered another. A world where Vale was real, where the cases were never-ending, where he was forever chasing the truth. Others believe he still walks the streets at night, in the rain, watching, waiting, for the next case, for the next crime, for the next time we forget that he's out there. Because one thing is certain, Sebastian Vale isn't just a character anymore. And maybe he never was.